When I first started dating Brandon, his parents were all smiles and warm welcomes. I met them on our third date. An early introduction that felt rushed. But he assured me they were just eager to meet me. His mom, Cheryl, seemed genuinely interested in my life, asking questions about my job, my hobbies, and how I grew up. His dad, Howard, was a bit more reserved but polite nonetheless. His attention mostly focused on Brandon, asking how work was going or talking about whatever sports game he had caught on TV the night before. I had no idea then how much their opinions, or more specifically, their need for control, would weigh on our relationship. At first, everything was normal. We would visit his parents for the occasional Sunday dinner, and they would ask the usual small talk questions. How's work going? What are your plans for the weekend? Nothing out of the ordinary. But over time, the questions began to shift. Instead of, how's work, it became, how much are you making now? Cheryl would casually ask about my salary, slipping it into conversation like it was no big deal. I brushed it off the first few times, assuming it was just her way of showing interest. Brandon didn't seem to mind, so I didn't bring it up. As months passed, the questioning got more personal. Cheryl started asking about my spending habits. Do you save a lot? Honey, she asked one night after dinner, while we were sitting around the table with coffee. It's important to save. You know, Brandon's really good with his money. He's always been smart about that. I gave a non-committal answer, trying to keep things light. I save when I can, I said, forcing a smile. But inside, I was starting to feel uneasy. The turning point came when Brandon and I started talking about moving in together. We had been dating for almost a year at that point, and things were getting serious. We both agreed it was time to take that next step. We began looking at apartments, getting excited about the prospect of finally having our own space. That's when his parents' behavior shifted from nosy to intrusive. One evening, we were sitting at their dining table, reviewing apartment listings on my laptop, when Cheryl and Howard began peppering us with questions. At first, it was the usual parental concerns. Is it a safe neighborhood? What's the commute like? But then Cheryl leaned in, her expression serious. You know, buying a place is a huge responsibility, she said. We just want to make sure you both are financially ready. I nodded, not thinking much of it. Yeah. We've talked about our budget. We're comfortable with what we can afford. Howard cleared his throat. We've been talking, and we think it would be a good idea if we took a look at your finances. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. What do you mean? I asked. Your bank statements. Your savings. Cheryl clarified, as if it were the most natural request in the world. We just want to make sure you're in a good place financially before you make any big decisions. I glanced at Brandon, expecting him to speak up. But he just sat there, looking uncomfortable. My heart started to race. I'm sorry, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But I don't think that's necessary. Brandon and I have already gone over our finances together. Cheryl's smile faded slightly, and Howard frowned. It's just that buying a place is a huge commitment, he said. We'd hate to see you two get in over your heads. I shook my head, standing my ground. We're not buying. We're renting. And we've been responsible about budgeting for it. Cheryl sighed, a look of disappointment crossing her face. It's not that we don't trust you, she said. But we want to make sure you're doing everything right. Brandon's our only son. We just want the best for him. My stomach tightened, and I felt a wave of frustration rising in my chest. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to concede, to hand over my financial information as if it were theirs to review. But there was no way I was going to let that happen. This was my personal life. My money. And I wasn't about to let his parents dictate how I managed it. I appreciate your concern, I said slowly. But I'm not comfortable sharing my bank statements. Cheryl's expression hardened. And Howard exchanged a glance with her before turning to me. If you have nothing to hide, what's the issue? I felt a lump form in my throat. But I pushed it down. It's not about hiding anything, I replied. It's about boundaries. My finances are private. And I don't feel it's appropriate for anyone other than Brandon and me to discuss them. Brandon, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. Mom. Dad. I think we've got this under control. Cheryl's eyes flashed with annoyance. And she turned to her son. Brandon. We're just trying to help. If something goes wrong, you'll be the one dealing with the consequences. Not her. I stood up, unable to sit through any more of their interrogation. Excuse me, I muttered, heading for the bathroom. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against the sink, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Demanding to see my bank statements? Who does that? After a few minutes, I collected myself and returned to the dining room. Brandon was still sitting at the table, but his parents had moved to the living room, whispering to each other. Are you okay? He asked quietly as I sat down. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. Brandon, this is crazy. Your parents have no right to ask for my financial information. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know. They're just worried. I shook my head in disbelief. This isn't normal. You need to talk to them. He hesitated, glancing over at his parents. I'll try. But you know how they are. They just want to make sure we're making the right decisions. I stared at him, my frustration turning into a deep sense of disappointment. This isn't about what they want, Brandon. This is about us. About our relationship. If they can't respect my boundaries, how are we supposed to move forward? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he just sat there, looking torn between me and his parents. The next few days were tense. Every time we visited his parents, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Cheryl and Howard stopped asking directly about my finances, but their disapproval was clear in every passive-aggressive comment they made. We just want to make sure Brandon's taken care of, Cheryl would say pointedly. Or, I hope you two know what you're doing. It all came to a head one weekend when Brandon and I were out looking at apartments. We had found a place we loved. A cozy one-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. The rent was within our budget, and we were excited to finally move forward. But then, as we sat in the leasing office, Brandon's phone buzzed with a text from his mom. She wants to know if we've found anything, he said, glancing at the message. I rolled my eyes. Do you really need to update her on every step we take? He looked at me, clearly uncomfortable. She's just curious. Brandon, this has to stop, I said, my voice firm. I can't deal with this constant interference. If we're going to build a life together, it has to be about us, not about what your parents think. He hesitated, biting his lip. I know, but they mean well. I stood up, my frustration boiling over. It doesn't matter what their intentions are. What matters is how it's affecting us. I can't keep doing this if you won't stand up for me. For us. The look on his face was one of guilt, but also of indecision. I'll talk to them, he finally said. I'll make sure they back off. But deep down, I wasn't sure he would. And as we walked out of the leasing office that day, The weight of his parents' expectations and their intrusion into our relationship felt heavier than ever. And I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end. As the weeks went by, things didn't improve. Brandon promised to talk to his parents. But every conversation ended the same, vague assurances and empty promises. I could feel the distance growing between us, like an invisible wall that neither of us was willing to break down. Every time I tried to bring it up, he'd brush it aside or tell me I was overreacting. Then one night, as we sat in silence over dinner, I realized something important. I deserved someone who would stand up for me. Someone who understood that building a life together meant drawing boundaries. I looked across the table at Brandon, his face buried in his phone, no doubt texting his mom again. And I knew I couldn't keep pretending this was going to work. "I think we need a break," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. He looked up, startled. "What? Where is this coming from?" I took a deep breath, the weight lifting from my shoulders as I finally said the words out loud. "I can't be with someone who lets their parents control their life. And I definitely can't be with someone who won't stand up for me." His silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. It was time to walk away and start living life on my terms, without the constant shadow of someone else's expectations hanging over me. And as hard as it was to let go, I knew I was choosing the one person I could always rely on, myself.